But before we get to today's subject matter, which is also General Bradley, Bill has a lovely disclaimer that we need to go over real quick.
Okay, so as an associate professor at the Command General Staff College, all opinions expressed here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the United States Army, the Command General Staff College, or the Department of War.
Got it. Thanks for doing that. Okay. I've listened to your podcast with Jonathan numerous times. For the uninitiated, what is it about?
Well, basically, it's a bunch of historians geeking out about various and sundry historical topics. Our predominant source of content comes from our own hallway and up and down the department at the Command General Staff College. And we try and bring in people who are subject matter experts. And we talk about things that, as we said, a slightly more formal version of a lunchroom conversation about a historical topic. So we do wild and varied topics. We've talked about everything from Napoleon to World War II to the history of mortuary affairs was one. International law, we've done it.
Well, that's why I like it. It's not pegged to a certain genre, and it's kind of guerrilla style where you guys are like, let's just talk about it. Let's not have a script. Let's go.
Yeah, it works for us, considering how much time we really have to do, because we do this in addition to our regular job. So we find a time for it.
No, I love it. Yeah, I recommend my listeners check it out. A Confused Heap of Facts, which is a great podcast. And today we're going to talk about General Omar Bradley. Yeah, I'm a very interesting guy. So we're going to dive into him here. He was born in 1893 in Clark, Missouri. He comes from modest roots. What was his upbringing like?
He kind of worked in industry a little bit before going to West Point. In many ways, your average turn of the 20th century guy, which is didn't go straight out of high school, had spent some time doing other things, was a very capable individual, and from Missouri. Yeah. So just another guy, kind of nobody of special importance right away.
I saw his father died when he was a teenager, so I wonder if that kind of matured him more quickly.
Possibly. Yeah. It's hard to tell, of course, from the distance of history, how things worked in terms of that. Having to kind of help provide for a family, kind of, chip in at an early age, certainly had something to do with that. And you kind of see those guys that have to do that, to kind of step into those roles. You see that come out in some of the things they value and all that kind of stuff. But overall, for the most part, yes, but so did a lot of other folks, if that makes sense, too.
All right, well, let's talk about his West Point time. I know he graduates in 1915, famously, quote, the class the stars fell on, end quote. What was unique about his graduating class, and how do you think it influenced his career path?
Bradley and his class hit the exact right time in terms of timing for becoming famous, if that makes sense. So 1915 to 1940 is 25 years. And what that meant was that his class were all of the mostly senior field grades, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels at the start of the Second World War. So we had longer careers back then. It was not uncommon for people to stay 30 plus years. Promotion was done by seniority. So when somebody retired or died or left the service, kind of next man up got promoted in terms of that. Other things came into it to a degree, but mostly it was where you were on the list. And Marshall, once we started the mobilization for World War II, really 1939, that's often missed, is that George C. Marshall actually started, with the concurrence of FDR, started the mobilization before our entry into the war. And these guys were just all the right ranks to fleet up, as it were. And so the class of 1915, nondescript in terms of the class of 1914, the class of 1916. It was just, they were at that right butter zone to move up, because we had what was called an expansible army, where the West Pointers were the regulars, whose job it was to lead the army during peacetime, get ready, and all that kind of stuff. And you had ROTC officers whose job, it's in the name, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. That's what ROTC stands for. And they were to go to college, get trained as a lieutenant, get some tactical stuff, and then go off and go be a shoemaker or something like that. Yeah. And then if war broke out, their job was to get called back to the colors and to command platoons and companies and battalions of draftees. Well, once we're standing up those, we're going to need divisions and corps and field armies. Well, who's going to command those? Well, it's going to be the regular army. Now, we don't have it in 1935, to pick a random year. We didn't really have a need for a lot of those formations. Now, we actually did have some of those headquarters in kind of like skeleton form, but nothing like the manning that we needed. Mm-hmm. So the idea was, once that happened, all those people kind of hanging out at those lower ranks, and it was not uncommon to spend 20, 30 years in the Army and be a lieutenant colonel or a colonel. The idea being is that when we need you, we'll pull you up. And that's what happened with Bradley's class, is these guys had been hanging out for 25 years. And all of a sudden, off you go. Now, it turned out that they did have a huge concentration of talent in that class, which happens, right?
Yeah.
But I would posit, and this is something that I've been looking at the more and more I've done it, a lot of them, it wasn't that, thank God, the West Point class of 1915 was there, if that makes sense. We had those. We have always had those people. We always had those people, and we will always have those people because they stepped up to the plate. Now, right. The Army schooling system throughout the 20s and the 30s had helped with that. So we had a bunch of pretty solid guys all kind of coming through together.
Well, and I think college is for two things. One is obviously learning. You learn stuff in college. The other part is networking, and he met a lot of other future generals that were his classmates.
What's funny though is like if you look at it, like we talk about 1915, and it is a class with a very high percentage of general officers. But the West Point class of 1909 is kind of funny too, because you got J.C.H. Lee, the commander of the communications zone, Field Army level command, although it's a logistician. William Simpson, commander of the 9th Army. George Patton, commander of the 3rd Army, obviously. And needs no introduction, right? And you have Courtney Hodges, who is not West Point, but year group 1909, all from the class of 1909, which is interesting on there. And what's funny is that Patton failed math as a class of 1908, got recycled to be in the class of 1909. Courtney Hodges was kicked out because he failed math, and William Simpson almost failed math.
Yeah.
So you think of this like this one math professor there. But West Point, the networking, it's a small army, right? So they all kind of get to know each other as they go, as they grow up and they come up together.
Right.
They all kind of hit the same schools. So West Point, the infantry school, the Command and General Staff College, the War College. All of these guys are kind of bouncing around together, so they get to kind of know each other throughout. Right. And getting kind of steeped in the doctrine, because that's where you sent your up-and-comers. You send them to school, and then you send them as instructors. So a lot of these guys had instructor duty at the same time as well.
Yeah, well, I know Bradley is commissioned as second lieutenant after graduation and serves on the Mexico-U.S. border. But unlike Patton, he doesn't serve in World War I on the front lines of Europe. What were kind of the inner war years like for Bradley before World War II?
He is pretty much doing, I hate to say it, but he's kind of like your generic Mark I officer in terms of that. He spent some time on the Mexican border, which, as you point out, and that's actually a pretty common assignment during the interwar years. My grandfather, who'd served in the 112th Cavalry, Texas National Guard, would tell stories to my dad. He passed before I was born, about patrolling the Mexican-American border. At that time, it was served as a professor of military science. Taught at West Point for any number of years. Math teacher, so not a huge fan myself. I mean, and just kind of bounced around. He did the infantry corps, served at the Command and General Staff College, taught tactics again. And what's interesting here is that you see him going to all the places that you would expect a reasonably successful officer of his generation to go to, if that makes sense. He taught under George C. Marshall at the infantry school, which helped. George C. Marshall is famous for having this black book where he scribbled in all these officers. To our knowledge, that doesn't actually exist.
It's just kind of a nondescript career until World War II. Like, you wouldn't project this guy as going to be one of the most famous generals.
No. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is these are just solid professionals who have had the Army's professional military education, who are thrust into a situation and have to make do.
Yeah.
Interesting. This is kind of harkening back to the Napoleonic era, perhaps a little bit, is those guys were also thrust into a scenario, but then, of course, it was a much more kind of brutal scenario. And what's interesting is if you look at the U.S. Army, we actually have more than our fair share of, I'll use the term, reasonably successful folks. Napoleon had kind of his bright shining stars, but he didn't really have a solid B cadre, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The A students and then the guys that you needed to, supervise tying their shoes. The United States Army had a very solid cadre of what I would call B plus students that could go out and do things. And we had our A students as well.
Right.
I would categorize Bradley more into the B plus to A student.
Well, you make a good point there. Like for every, you have Patton and Eisenhower, MacArthur and Bradley and all these big names. But then, like you said, you have Simpson, you have Hodges, you have kind of these other guys who don't get all the flash, but they're still very competent.
Beavers, Patch, a whole cast of characters. Troy Middleton actually was teaching school and recalled to active duty and became one of the best corps commanders in the United States Army.
Right. Wow. Well, we'll dive into World War II, I guess, now, because it's kind of it's a large topic it's what makes Bradley famous. Let's start off with the North Africa campaign. He sees combat in 1943 under General Patton in North Africa. You and I were talking before we came on of the Patton movie. How did serving under Patton kind of shape Bradley's own command philosophy?
I don't know if it shaped his philosophy as so much as it gave him an opportunity to have a command philosophy, if that makes sense. So Bradley starts the war, or starts the campaign, I think is a better term, serving on Eisenhower's staff. Long short story, Eisenhower is the theater commander of the North African theater. And he has kind of a land component commander who is, you got General Alexander, who's the commander of the 18th Army Group. In Army terms, that's the land component commander. He had an Air Force component commander and a Sea component commander. But Bradley is serving as a general officer on his staff. Eisenhower is having problems in Tunisia before Patton even shows up. So he sends Bradley out to figure out what the heck's going on. Patton comes in, has to figure out the Second Corps. Patton actually was already a Corps commander. He had been commanding out in Morocco. And Patton says, I need somebody capable and competent that I trust. He knows Bradley. They've kicked around the Army. They have familiarity. Bradley's got a good reputation. So Patton says, I want him. It also helped that Bradley was kind of that generation we talked about, where he was kind of on the short list to take Corps command anyways. But before they could do that, they needed to kind of get things back on track. So Bradley kind of serves underneath Patton to kind of get him moving. And they have very different personalities, right? Bradley's kind of a quieter dude a little bit. Patton, of course, is, Patton.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, they kind of work, if that makes sense. Bradley starts off as kind of his deputy commander, kind of kicks around a couple things. And overall, what it does is that, as I said, by that point, the guy I'd have to do math real quick, which is always dangerous in public. But he's 40, almost 50 years old by this point. But what he's done is he's had a good opportunity to kind of, he sees Patton and okay, that's okay, I got it. But he's able to kind of come in and be the good cop to Patton's bad cop, if that makes sense. And that works for the Second Corps. Because first off, they kind of start off as commanding general staff officer. And then as the campaign in Tunisia is grinding on, Patton's actually pulled back to command the command that he was supposed to have, which was the 7th Army.
Mm-hmm.
Bradley is then put in the command that he was supposed to have. Well, he had never been tapped originally to be the Second Corps commander. That had been Lloyd Friedendahl.
Yeah.
That had not worked out well.
We don't have time to go down the incompetence of Friedendahl. We can do that some other time.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. So Bradley was the next man up, as it were. So Bradley actually finishes the campaign as the Second Corps commander and very competently leads the Second Corps through a series of pretty grinding battles.
Yeah, and even his nickname, quote, the GI's general, he dressed very plainly. Meanwhile, Patton has the shiny helmet and the riding boots. I think they just contrasted each other nicely.
Yeah, I would argue that I think Bradley is a more stereotypical. He's closer to the norm than Patton was, if that makes sense. An army can only hold so many Pattons in the world.
Right. Well, Eisenhower's already impressed with the rising general, saying of Bradley, quote, "There is very little I need to tell you about him because he is running absolutely true to form all the time. He has brains, a fine capacity for leadership, and a thorough understanding of the requirements of modern battle. He has never caused me one moment of worry. He is perfectly capable of running an army. He has the respect of all of his associates, including the British officers that have met him," end quote. So he must be doing something right.
Yeah, and I want to key on that British thing for just a minute, because this is a very awkward time in the U.S. Army. British actually make up the predominance of forces in the Tunisian theater. You have the entire Eighth Army. You have the British First Army. You have a French corps present, which they didn't want to be associated with the British First Army. There's this whole weird thing where if the Brits want to send a command to the French, it has to go up to theater headquarters and down, because the French and the British, Mers el Kabir, where the Brits sank the French fleet,
Right.
still an open problem.
Right.
And Bradley has to deal with this. The British are not terribly impressed with the fighting qualities of the American army. And this is, of course, in all the literature that's there. You have an ally that's been doing this for a couple of years and looking at you going, why can't you get your stuff together?
Right. Right. Well, yeah. Kasserine Pass probably didn't help that.
No, but what's interesting is how quickly we actually put ourselves back together again. Mark Calhoun has done a really good job highlighting that Kasserine Pass started bad but got better, and the American Army starts to get through this. But again, this requires some coaching and some leadership to get through, not just to kind of get the soldiers through their own getting started kind of campaign, but also having to do the up and out with the British First Army leadership and also just the British Army Group commander, because the Brits don't really appreciate what the Americans are doing. They don't appreciate where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
So Bradley's having to work through all of this and reach some success.
Right. Well, that's going to continue to happen throughout our next few topics. The next one is the Sicily campaign. So we win North Africa. Now we're going to invade the soft underbelly of Europe, which is Italy. Bradley commands the Second Corps during the invasion of Sicily. What challenges did he face here, and how did he overcome those?
So Bradley has the first problem of he is a corps commander with an army headquarters that has precisely one corps working for it at the time. So if you've ever had a boss where you're the only show in town, that was Bradley for a while. Now Patton's going to eventually create a provisional corps, stealing combat power from Bradley, to go do his race around the flank. That's actually Keyes doing most of that fighting around the flank. And Bradley is faced with kind of a hard, bloody, slugging match up the center of the island. And for those that have ever been to Sicily, the place it's one gigantic mountain chain. I mean, the only place you can really even maneuver effectively is the coastal plains. The center of the island is just one big mountain after another mountain after another mountain. And this is a mechanized/motorized army. All of the supplies, the stuff and things, have to go on trucks, which they're going on these goat paths up the mountains. So Bradley's got to figure out how to make all of this work against a German force that is very intent on not getting crushed. It is a series of just exceptionally bloody and hard division and corps fights, because when you have a corps fight, like what makes a corps fight different than a division fight? If you've got two battalions fighting alongside each other, supporting each other, where there's one coherent action, that's a regimental fight. Two regiments doing the same thing, that's a division fight. Mm-hmm. Two divisions doing that's a corps fight. And so you're having to scope out your field of view as much. And so he's got all these little micro battles going on that he has to piece together so that they're actually doing something intelligent.
Right.
Because fighting is not just run at the enemy. I want ground, but I want the right ground. And that's what Bradley and his corps commanders are having to fight through. At the same time, he's got Patton sitting there going, we got to beat the British to Messina. And taking his combat power as he's whipping around the coastal plain.
Yeah, I think it just gets kind of glossed over, like, oh, the British had trouble and the Americans just flew through Sicily, but that's not the case.
Oh yeah, so there's a couple really good books on the 1st Infantry Division that just talk about the hard fighting during this time frame. There was more than the 1st Infantry Division there. There was the 3rd Infantry Division, there was the 1st Armored Division. All of these, like, the divisions from Tunisia are there as well.
Well, yeah, no, that's an interesting topic. Moving on in his career, we get to D-Day in Normandy, and he's the commander of U.S. First Army, and he's helped plan and lead the landings at Omaha and Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. What role did Bradley play in the success of D-Day? Because I know Patton's kind of a decoy. He's in charge of the Ghost Army. So what is Bradley's role here?
So the task organization going onto the beaches in Normandy is they're all under the command of the 21st Army Group. That is General Montgomery. And he has two armies working for him, the Second Army and then the Second British Army and the First American Army. Bradley is the commander of all American forces landing in Normandy on the 6th of June. And his primary role on D-Day is almost just sitting and watching. So you've got two corps going ashore. You've got the 5th Corps at Omaha and the 7th Corps at Utah. And each of those corps commanders are managing that fight independently. Bradley does not really have a tactical role until he can actually get both of his corps ashore and manage them together. Now, he does have a serious conversation on the 6th of June about mid-morning as whether or not he's got to pull the plug on Omaha Beach. That's an Army commander's decision. Because if you pull the plug on Omaha, that half the Army is now not ashore. And ramifications all over the place. That's going to be Bradley's recommendation to make to Montgomery. And so he has to deal with that, and it helps that he just kind of lets it roll. Now, what he does once they're ashore is that his army is in a field army in World War II is what's called an administrative and a tactical headquarters. So administrative is not just like paperwork. It's also the logistics, it's the sustainment, it's managing all the different enablers and all that kind of stuff. So his job is making sure that the 5th Corps and the 7th Corps are synchronized and that their divisions are receiving all of the necessary sustainment to get ashore. That's a harder task than it sounds like because everything is coming ashore via landing craft. And then once you get the mulberries built, they're coming ashore via the mulberries. The problem being is you can still only land so much at a time. And this is a problem I play with my students a lot of time. How many meat eaters, tankers, infantrymen, do you put ashore before all of a sudden now you have to put ashore the sustainers? If you put ashore nothing but infantrymen, they're all going to starve to death and run out of ammo. But if you put ashore too many sustainers and not enough infantrymen, the sustainers are going to be picking up rifles and running for the beaches because we love our sustainers, but we prefer them to not fight.
And that's like the old saying, amateurs talk about strategy and experts talk about logistics.
And that's what the Army headquarters is doing in Normandy there. He's also giving them priorities. For instance, once we land, 5th Corps is going to kind of hold what they got. 7th Corps is going to Cherbourg. 7th Corps is the main effort. They're going up to Cherbourg to get that port, open that port, so that then they can get that in. Then, once he's got 5th Corps and 7th Corps online, by the way, he's landed a couple additional Corps headquarters by this point. He's managing 4 Corps headquarters, call it 12 to 15 divisions, all in that space. And if you've ever driven around Normandy, you're talking a couple 100,000 people all in an area that you can drive across in about an hour and a half.
Right. And for all the John Wayne and Saving Private Ryan where they're on Omaha Beach, like that wasn't his job to be, taking pillboxes. It was his job to kind of manage everything.
His job is making sure that now his staff's job, and he's supervising that, but literally making sure that the 1st Infantry Division has enough 105 artillery to engage and that they are going to be at a certain point in order to enable 7th Corps' attack a little bit farther on down the line. That's his job, is watching those guys do their thing.
Correct. Okay. Well, let's talk about the breakout from Normandy now. Bradley oversees Operation Cobra, the breakout that allowed the Allied forces to race across France. Why is this operation considered to be one of Bradley's greatest achievements?
This is one of the coolest military operational moves the U.S. Army has in its history. You have 4 corps at least, more if you count the rest of First Army, all moving in time and space across a very, very narrow front. So it starts off, he's going to mass the 7th Corps on a very, very narrow front. And he's going to give the 7th Corps 6 divisions. That's a lot. A typical corps is, well, by definition, a corps is 2 or more divisions. 6 is basically a field army. You've got a field army.
How many troops are we talking in a division and a corps, roughly?
Infantry division, anywhere with attachments, about 15,000 people.
Okay.
So 90,000 men.
In a corps?
In 7th Corps.
Okay. So it's a lot of people on a very narrow strip.
Very narrow space. And then, so his plan is to break out from Normandy, but they race across France is not yet thought of, if that makes sense. They don't realize how much they're going to succeed. But they just need to get out of the bocage. They need to get into some open country so we can use our mobility to greatest effect. So he's going to sit down with the Army Air Corps, the strategic air forces in particular, and he says, okay, I want all these bombers to come in, and I want them to basically pulverize this very small area with lots of bombs. Now, they learned from the British. Bradley's learning vicariously here. The British had used regular old high explosive bombs, created a bunch of large craters. Bradley's like, I don't want those. I want smaller bombs because the problem is that with all the craters, then it's hard to maneuver around. Now, the problem is that the Army Air Corps wanted to come perpendicular over the target. So flying over American forces, dropping the bombs once they hit the target point.
Makes sense.
It's fair.
Yep.
The Bradley was very concerned about that because if, somebody, misses their, is flying a little bit behind, drops early, you're dropping on American soldiers. So for that reason, he wanted the Army Air Corps to come parallel, to fly directly over the Germans, and then that way any short or long bombs land on Germans. That's what he proposes. That's what he thinks is the plan. The Army Air Corps does not agree. And, of course, they come in over perpendicular because their concern is the longer we're over enemy lines, flying nice and slow, the bigger of a target we are. The strategic air forces, in particular, the B-17s and B-24s, strategic assets. Those are war-winning assets, according to the Army Air Corps. And what ends up happening is so they come over perpendicular. The first day, there's cloud cover and all that kind of stuff, but they don't get the recall order. They do a massive short bombing, kill lots of American soldiers, to include General Leslie McNair. And wow, that sucked. Well, they do it again the next day. They're still short bombing because at this point, remember, everyone's just bombing off of when the lead guy drops, you drop and you put a pattern over the target. That works so long as everyone's nice and closed up and everyone is dropping off the right point. If some people are behind, they don't realize they're behind, or if there's any sort of, they twitch early, you're going to drop it on friendly troops. We killed darn near a battalion of the 30th Infantry Division during this operation. Mm-hmm. But yet Bradley says, we're going there. You have to give Bradley the credit for, even after that had happened, he said, we're doing it anyways. I know it's bad. We're going anyways. And then at that point, 7th Corps breaks. 7th Corps begins its penetration. That's then followed by 8th Corps. So another 40 to 45,000 soldiers.
But they're pulverizing the German lines now, right?
Oh, yeah. So the German lines are pulverized. But even so, they're still putting up a hard fight. So 7th Corps takes a minute or two to get through. They actually punch through the German lines. 8th Corps comes behind them, running for leather, button hooks west, had to think for a second, into Brittany to take the port of Brest. Then behind 8th Corps, you have, in order, the 12th Corps, the 15th Corps, and the 20th Corps, which will become the Patton's Third Army, all coming out and then hooking east, going across central France during that time frame. They kind of use the Loire River as their right boundary line, and they're just running for it. And then at the same time, the rest of First Army, so the 5th Corps and the 19th Corps, and then once 7th Corps kind of breaks out, they kind of hook in and kind of hang on to the outer edge of that swinging door. The 5th and the 19th Corps are holding on to the Germans and keep pushing them. So you've got, 7 corps all maneuvering in space, causing effects on the Germans, bad effects on the Germans.
It reminds me of, as you know, Generals and Napoleon's my other podcast, but for his invasion of Spain, he kind of did that same sledgehammer where you punch a hole, and then once you're through, the parts of the sledgehammer kind of hook and mop up whatever's behind them or in front of them after they get through that hard line.
Oh, yeah. And what ends up happening is after Cobra is so successful, now the British are doing their own operation over on the other side. As Patton's Third Army becomes active, Bradley is then pulled up to be the 12th Army Group commander. And so Bradley has to command and control all of this. And the controversy of Cobra is, of course, the fillet pocket, which is where Bradley tells Patton to not have the 15th Corps close the gap and seal up with the Germans. Bradley is very, very worried about fratricide. And as one of my former commanders said, whenever you have two blue arrows pointed at each other, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a blue arrow; it was actually a force from another army group. And not only that, they were actually poles on the north end of that pocket. So they don't even speak the same language. The only thing that you have is that we're carrying the same equipment, but you don't have the same radios, no language, different units. And Bradley was very, very concerned that we were going to basically kill each other as we raced into each other. Patton, to his death, asserts that he could have closed that gap, and Bradley told him not to.
Well, also, do you think there's an ego thing there a little bit? Because Bradley was working for Patton, and now the situation's changed a little bit.
Yeah, there is. Patton's Patton. The reason Patton was not the 12th Army Group commander is that Patton, shall we say, could not play nice with others. And when you're an Army Group commander, your job is to be the play nice with others, for lack of a better term.
It's coalition warfare. Yeah, you have to.
Bradley, you could argue, is not that great either at it sometimes, but he was certainly better at it than Patton. So you kind of flip the roles, because Patton's actually, interesting enough, Bradley's Army commanders are all senior to him. He's a class of 1915. Patton is senior to him. Courtney Hodges is senior to him. And when he shows up on the continent, William Simpson will be senior to him as well. But yet, Bradley kind of is in the right place at the right time with right enough capabilities. Eisenhower trusted him. Eisenhower wasn't going to put somebody new into that role, but he certainly wasn't going to put Patton there.
That segues nicely into our next topic, coalition warfare. Obviously the Americans and British race across France and things are looking good. And then in late 1944, the Battle of the Bulge occurs, and Bradley's commanding U.S. forces during Germany's surprise offensive. How did Bradley respond to the crisis of the Battle of the Bulge?
So I'm going to back up just a little bit in terms of that. So Bradley had three armies in the line by this point in the game. He had 9th Army way up in the north, north of Aachen, and they were holding the line. Then you had the 1st Army mostly concentrated just to the east of Aachen, and they're fighting in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, which most people have probably heard of if they've looked at World War II. Bloody, hard fighting that really, quite frankly, Bradley should have pulled Courtney Hodges by the scruff of his neck and said, dude, come up with a better way other than, hey, diddle straight up the middle. There are other ways of getting at. Hurtgen Forest was a place that needed to be taken. It could have been isolated, though, and then taken. But Courtney Hodges was not a great tactician. And then you had the 3rd Army down in the south fighting in Lorraine around Metz. When the Battle of the Bulge kicked off, they'd all just finished an offensive. The November offensive is what I call it, and I've heard it seen that called cut other places. 9th Army had attacked to the Roer River. The 1st Army had mostly slugged through the Hurtgen Forest, leaving the 8th Corps to hold a big, wide front in the Ardennes. And then 3rd Army had gotten to the Saar River down in the south. Bradley's headquarters was in Luxembourg City, which is very, very far forward. So when penetration happens in the 8th Corps, he is suddenly out of communications with most of 1st Army headquarters and with 9th Army headquarters. So his first reaction is that he tells 9th Army to basically pitch its reserves and whatever else they need to do down south into 1st Army. Some of the records are debating as to who made the first phone call, whether it was Simpson on his own, sending his initial reserves and then sending the rest on order, or if Bradley did the initial order. I'm more on the side that Simpson sent the 7th Armored Division, which fought at St. Vith, on its own, and then he sent the rest of his combat power on order from Bradley. But Bradley, to his credit, did the one thing, he did one order that I think saved the battle for the Americans. I don't think the Germans were ever going to win this one either, but it kept a bad situation from being worse. He physically sent the order, just whether they were already moving, to 7th Armored Division, and he also ordered Patton to send the 10th Armored Division north at the same time. So 2 armored divisions, one from the north, one from the south, go. The 7th Armored Division fights at St. Vith and basically stops the entire German northern shoulder in its tracks. They eventually get almost encircled and have to pull back. But it's a heroic stand. My opinion, probably more important than the one at Bastogne. Then you have the 10th Armored Division, which comes up and gets to the Bastogne area just as the 20th Infantry Division, which had been fighting in that area, is folded up. The 20th Infantry Division doesn't get nearly enough credit. They had basically been slaughtered, holding the line, fighting backwards to buy time. 10th Armored Division shows up, and there you go. And then they buy enough time for the 101st Airborne to get to Bastogne and become surrounded. So Bradley's one order by sending those two divisions is enough to completely disrupt the entire German offensive. Now, I don't always give Bradley credit on everything, but I will give Bradley ultimate credit for that one order. Right. Because that, at that point, caused everything else to go into effect. He then got Patton's army started to move. Simpson sent the First Army a bunch of reinforcements, and we were able to start filling in from there. Now, he did lose command of control of 2/3 of his army group during this time frame, because once the penetration had occurred and he'd done those initial orders, Eisenhower looked at this and said, Bradley, you can't talk to your guys. So he gave Montgomery a temporary command of the 1st and 9th Armies. So Bradley only had command of the 3rd Army for a while.
How did Brad feel about that?
Not well. So Bradley and Montgomery had been feuding the entire fall. They both believed that each of them should be the main effort. And Eisenhower had basically been saying, no, you both would take the broad front strategy. Going to spread it out. Bear in mind that the same people who were on Bradley's staff in December of 1944, many of them are the same people who were on his staff in the 2nd Corps in Tunisia when the British Army, many of whom are now working with Montgomery in the 21st Army Group, all thought that the Americans were a bunch of incompetent rubes who didn't know what they were doing. There's a lot of history going on between these guys, and Bradley and Montgomery do not get along, and they're not happy with each other about it. Eisenhower and Montgomery almost come to blows on it. Eisenhower almost fires Montgomery.
Yeah, and there's a lot to it. We obviously don't have time to get on this pod, but I think both countries' militaries saw themselves as the senior partner. The U.S. is supplying men and material and weapons and food, and meanwhile the British have been fighting the Germans for many more years than the Americans have, and they know what they're doing. So just a clash of ideologies, I think. Right, and just people who are very passionate about what they do, who are pretty competent at what they do, with different opinions about how to proceed. I mean, you don't get where you are by being an Army Group commander, by being a complete incompetent. Right. And so imagine this, like two CEOs who are put in the same room and being told to come up with a plan. They're kind of clash. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads to my next subject. Let's talk about Bradley's relationship with Eisenhower and Patton. He often served as a middle ground between Eisenhower's diplomacy and Patton's aggression. How did Bradley's kind of even temperament influence the Allied high command? He was kind of the adult supervision for Patton, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And his job, one of his specified tasks, was basically to keep Patton on a leash. And not so much tactically. Bradley actually let Patton get away with all sorts of stuff tactically that he shouldn't have gotten away with. Mm-hmm. But where it really did was that Bradley's job was to make sure that Patton minded his manners around the British and minded his manners around the press to a degree. And so Bradley's job was just kind of keeping Patton the send towards enemy kind of thing. You look at the high command in Northwest Europe in 44, 45, and it's very much an in-group. They all knew each other, and many of them had been together since Torch. Patton had commanded at Casablanca. Bradley had been in that crowd. Eisenhower had been in that crowd. All their staffs had kind of come up with them during this time frame. Hodges had actually commanded the 3rd Army before it showed up in England, but was Bradley's chosen successor to lead him in the 1st Army. All of these guys kind of know each other, and so Bradley he's not quite what Malden portrays him as in the movie Patton in terms of the spreading oil on Patton's troubled waters kind of thing. But his job is really to kind of reach out and grab Patton by the scruff of his neck and pull him back because Eisenhower's got other fish to fry. Right. Yeah, the the war ends May 1945 in Europe, and his post-war career is kind of interesting as well. He's the very first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, appointed in 1949. He became the first person to hold this position. What does he accomplish in this role? This is kind of unique.
So this is where when Truman is desegregating the army, he also ends up presiding over the demobilization, but he presides over the remobilization of the army in time for Korea, and that's a challenge, right? Because Korea technically is not a declared war, so he's trying to figure out how to work with this and deal with a fairly obstreperous theater commander by Douglas MacArthur. And if you thought it was awkward where Bradley was like 5 to 6 years junior to Patton, MacArthur had been the superintendent at West Point when most of the general officers who were in the Army had been there. See, he had been a general officer since like 1916.
Right.
So what you have is this guy who is self-proclaimed the living embodiment of the history of the United States as a theater commander who is supposed to be subordinate to you.
And then, like Bradley's like, all right, well, I somehow kept Patton under control, relative control, and that was a major ego. But now here I go again with an even bigger ego.
Yeah, I mean, MacArthur had basically been living a life as an imperial viceroy in Japan during this time frame, and at first he's just busy trying to keep things from falling apart in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, okay, we have got the Incheon landing. MacArthur's doing well. And then all of a sudden, MacArthur's like, hey, I can take this and go north. Bradley and Truman both get fault for this, which is they both kind of go with the, well, if you can do it, why not? Truman doesn't really want this being a big war, but alternatively, he's willing to take one if it falls into his lap, if that makes sense. There's a lot of detail work that goes into this, but bottom line is that MacArthur gets all the way up to the Yalu, pushes way past where he should have been, and when MacArthur is pushing up against this, he's asking for nuclear weapons. Bradley at that point has to sit there and go, there's this great line from Bradley where Bradley's going, dude, you need to dial it back like by 1,000.
Well, yeah, there's a great quote. He says, the war in Korea is, quote, the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time, end quote. And I think what he means, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like we just fought a horrible World War II that many people died. Now we're fighting again, and we're talking about escalating in a different part of the world. Like, it just seems like Bradley was onto something. Like, maybe we need to simmer it down a minute.
Well, yeah, it's like the challenges of fighting the Indo-Pacific today. The Pacific Ocean's like half the globe.
Yeah.
And all of your stuff and things has to come from the continental United States. Yes, we've got some stuff built up in Japan, but not a lot. So all the soldiers, all the tanks, all the rifles, belt buckles, boots, all that stuff has to come from the United States. And he's like, we do not want to get involved in this because, oh, by the way, we're also having the heating up of the Cold War. You've had the Berlin crisis by this point. The Soviets are detonating nuclear weapons. We are much more worried about the protection of Europe. The Marshall Plan's about to go into effect. This is not the time to get in to decide that we're going to fully mobilize the country to fight in some small country in Northeast Asia. So he's sitting there going, guys, we have a win. Let's keep it. And so he kind of gets into an awkward spot here because was the guy that was brought in when the army's been cut to the bone. And then he kind of is the guy holding the bag when all of a sudden Truman says, I need an army. And Bradley has to say, well, sir, it's going to take a minute.
Yeah. Because you were the Axeman where you're getting rid of people are, putting them on early retirement. Now you need them back. Yeah, that's tricky. Let's talk about his later years. He wrote a memoir called A Soldier Story in 1951, reflecting on his wartime service. Does it give us any insights on his leadership style?
Yes. So Bradley actually wrote 2 memoirs. The first is A Soldier Story, and then another, it's got a co-author, A General's Life. And it's interesting where Bradley's memoirs show a very good leader, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Bradley had a very good, Bradley did a lot of good things. Bradley also got a chance to very carefully curate his public image. And this is something that we have to take into account as we look at him. Bradley did do all these things. He did lead the 12th Army Group through combat. He did lead the Army through a very trying time in the late 40s and early 50s. But he also had his challenges, right? The Filet Pocket is one. His feuding with Montgomery when it wasn't really necessary is perhaps another, although we talked about that a little bit. But so we just have to be careful of reading too much into his personal stuff. But what I'd say is that he comes across as, if you just kind of do things in a steady, orderly manner, it typically works out okay.
Yeah.
He was not very forgiving of failure, though, or perceived failure.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we were talking about a little bit before we started. 15 general officers are fired in the 12th Army Group. 13 of them are fired by some combination of Omar Bradley and Courtney Hodges. And that's a massive unbalance. Simpson fired 0, and Patton fired 2, one of whom was General Jones, the commander of the 106th Infantry Division at the Battle of the Bulge, who'd suffered a heart attack, lost 2/3 of his division, and asked to be relieved. He's an interesting character. On one hand, he presents a calm demeanor and an interesting foil to Patton. On the other, he tends to be a very demanding, by-the-numbers personality.
Yeah, you and I were talking before, he was the technical advisor in the Patton movie, so obviously he looks good in there. And memoirs by nature, I don't care if you're U.S. Grant or Marshall Marmont, they're going to paint you in a flattering light if you wrote it. Even if that's not your intention, it's just going to happen.
We are all the main characters in our own life stories.
Correct. So yeah, while he's known for his calm and modest demeanor and his genuine care for troops, he dies in 1981 at the old age of 88. What do you think his legacy is? Because he's not as famous as Patton or Eisenhower. He's very capable general.
Well, he's one of the only Army Group commanders in the history of the United States. You could almost count them on one hand. If you go back to the Civil War like I do, you have to add Sherman and then Grant in that mix too. But one of the only handful of Army Group commanders that's out there. He's a complex individual, but yet he does show that being a steady, reliable officer can achieve effects. You don't need to be a Patton to achieve success on the battlefield. And in point of fact, sometimes that's counterproductive. I think sometimes he was overly harsh. He helped perpetuate a culture of fire you rather than develop you in Northwest Europe that had some negative impacts in the Army overall. But he also presided over some pretty important things, including, I believe, the integration of the Army. I think that's during his time frame. And also kind of figuring out what the role of the chairman was, because you get to be the first one, so you get to make it up. You get to set your own role, as it were.
Well, even if you look at the service record, like North Africa was a victory, Sicily was a victory, Operation Cobra was a victory, the Battle of the Bulge was a victory. So he's on the winning side of all of these. Now, whether that's coincidental or not, the fact remains what I just said.
Yeah, and this is something that I'll really hit with some other generals, perhaps. But you don't need to be a jerk in order to win. And Bradley, while not always on that line, was more on that line than many other generals that we care to idealize.
That's good stuff. Thank you for that, Bill. Good overall biography on General Bradley. If you'd like to hear more from the great Bill Nance, please check out his podcast, A Confused Heap of Facts. And we thank him for his time.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.